Tonight on Nation to Nation, Perry Bellegarde is not running again for National Chief of the AFN. The successor will be voted for by virtual ballot. A First Nations scholar says virtual voting by the grassroots could make the AFN more relevant.
Because the AFN would then have a model to be able to represent First Nations interests, not the interests of program delivery model from the federal government.
NDP MP Niigaan has a private member's bill going through Parliament. She wants an emergency declared over the climate crisis.
We either act now, or we're going to further exacerbate this crisis we're in.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamourant, and welcome to Nation. It's a new year, thankfully, and with a new year, what should be on the radar of Indigenous people as we move forward into it? Is it the new UNDRIP bill, C-15, or the Assembly of First Nations gearing up to elect a new national chief this summer? To help me navigate these issues, I'm joined by Dr. Niigaan Sinclair. He's a professor of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba and writes a regular column for the Winnipeg Free Press. Welcome to Nation, Dr. Sinclair.
Bonjour, Todd. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
As I just said in my intro, there will be a new national chief because Perry Bellegarde has decided not to run again. In a recent column, you said the AFN must now change. What do you mean, and what are the forces driving this change?
Well, I mean, it's a bit of a broken record to say that the AFN needs to change because, if anything, it is probably been the same since the 1990s. I mean, really, the last time the AFN was really effective was probably during the constitutional negotiations for the Charlottetown Accord. Now, while it's been able to get program dollars, and particularly some kind of, some smaller initiatives, most recently with the federal government, the AFN has been, for the most part, a status quo organization, refusing and resisting change on every term. And you just have to look at it in terms of, is it a government? It often acts like it's a government, but it's really a lobby group for chiefs. And I think generally First Nations peoples on the ground, the grassroots, as we saw during Idle No More, are a real rejection of the AFN going on now almost 10 years.
I suppose then the next question is what would make it more relevant then, so that it isn't just seen as from some First Nations people as just propping up the current government?
It really has been a program delivery model and a sort of discussion think tank on behalf of the federal government, and therefore it's really it's always been something that's been dependent on federal dollars. The AFN depends mostly on federal dollars. Therefore, it's never been seen as a legitimate organization by grassroots First Nations people. So what it might do, and if we think about the current pandemic as being a possible model, if the new national chief is going to be voted on virtually this coming July after Perry Bellegarde says he won't stand for re-election, why can't we allow everyday First Nation citizens to have a say in the national chief? If that was the case, then I think maybe the AFN would have some legitimacy at the grassroots. It would be difficult to develop, certainly difficult to deliver because of infrastructure, Wi-Fi on First Nations, but it would be an initiative, I think, worth looking at because the AFN would then have a model to be able to represent First Nations interests, not the interests of program delivery model from the federal government. That's just one step, but of course, there's many more. Economic independence, creating and assisting the governance model on First Nations, looking at First Nations concerns and interests, even the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. I mean, could you imagine if we adopted the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples' original goal, which was to have an Aboriginal Parliament, and maybe the AFN could be that possible delivery model. There's lots of possibility here, but however, I don't see a lot of change coming anytime soon because I see the AFN as being very reliant on the old way of doing business.
So I know in that column you also speculated that it may be time for a woman to be the national chief, but it sounds like even if a woman was the national chief, things might not change.
Most of our cultures are matriarchal, they're women-centered. Especially with grandmothers. And so that has not delivered itself, though, however, with Indian policy. And so at the chief's level, built on Indian Act chiefs and councils. We don't see a lot of women at that position. So really the best to perform for a national chief was Roberta Jameson, who in 2003 got about 40% of the chiefs' votes for national chief. And we've never seen really any success. We've seen several important people who have run, Sheila North, Pam Palmater, others as well. But the fact is that the AFN has not only a problem with women in leadership positions, approximately half the staff are women who work within the AFN, but it's mistreated those women within the organization. And there, of course, are many rumors and many stories that can be told about women being mistreated by chiefs within the organization as well. And so people have called this the really Me Too reckoning, the Me Too movement of the AFN. And people are now saying, well, potentially a woman in charge of the organization could institute the reports. And we heard about this particularly during the last AFN General Assembly, when Roseanne Archibald, the Ontario regional chief, really brought this to the forefront and demanded and received assent from the chiefs in order to do a massive wide-scale investigation on the mistreatment of women in the organization. So I think change is coming in that direction, and I think a woman national chief, while the organization may not change, we may see a woman national chief that may signal some internal changes of the treatment of women in the organization, and it's been a long time coming and needed.
Now we're talking about what might happen to the AFN in the summer, but of course there's a few months to go, and Perry Bellegarde has said his mission is to get the UNDRIP bill, C-15, passed into law, a tall order for a minority government to do. Are you as confident as he is?
Well, I think I don't think there's a question it's going to be passed, and we've seen that there is certainly the majority amount of support from the Liberals, probably supported by the NDP, who originally supported Romeo Saganash's bill in Parliament, and of course within the Senate there is a great deal of support. We have to remember Romeo Saganash's bill C-262 almost received royal assent last time around, and so there was a bit of a negotiation among the senators, which is really where that bill died. The senators who at that time, the conservative senators who held the measure of power, agreed to let C-92 and C-91 through and not let C-262 through, which was the United Nations Declaration bill, because there's a wide-scale, frankly, ignorance around the bill, around the idea that the United Nations Declaration is going to be some kind of veto, which is not. All it's saying is that Canadian law should come into tune with Indigenous law. There's lots of criticism with C-15. And so if Perry Bellegarde wishes to put that on his hat, it would be really a symbol of his entire time in office, which has been to get really small ornamental change, program dollars, get small steps done with this Liberal government. And that's all C-15 really is. It's a small step to try to bring Canadian law in tune with Indigenous law. Now, of course, there are tons of problems with C-15. The number one problem is will Indigenous law then come under the guise, under the purview, under the control of Canadian law? Indigenous law is inherent. It's not tied to Canadian law. The Delgamau decision reminds us of that. So how will legislators deal with that? And frankly, I don't have a lot of faith in Canadian legislatures to understand Indigenous law. Therefore, the implementation of the United Nations Declaration will look like how it is in BC, which is a real kind of very small symbolic change, if anything. And the C-15, I think it'll pass, but I think not a lot of change will come from it.
Finally, Dr. Sinclair, outside of C-15, is there anything else that should be a priority for the Trudeau government in 2021?
Well, I mean, we have been talking about the AFN. The AFN's problem is branding, and I say branding meaning what it looks like. What is the impression? And it's always been a case where the AFN, the Liberals need the AFN more than the AFN need the Liberals, or the AFN doesn't need the government as much as it presumes that it does. What I mean by that is that without the AFN, the Liberals really would have no method for consultation, have no method in which who to speak to when it comes to major national issues. And if the Liberals lost the AFN, if the AFN in some way were to reshape itself or regovern or restructure, the federal government would have nobody left to speak to on major issues, and then would be stuck because it has to follow the law under Section 35 of the Constitution. But then what does that look like? Can it use the AFN models? Would it have to move to the Treaty Alliance model that Grand Chief from Manitoba, Derek Neepanak, was one of the front end speakers of when he was Grand Chief here in Manitoba? The federal Liberals really have a challenge. Not only do they have COVID to deal with, not only have a massive budget shortfall to deal with, not only do they have this vaccine to roll out, but they also have a massive problem with Indigenous affairs. And it's really been set up in over-expectation and under-delivery. And as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, First Nations are in dire poverty, and that affects everybody in the country. So you can't just say, oh, well, that's their problem anymore, because the problem is that Indigenous poverty leads to an infestation of the disease on First Nations. That comes back to cities. That means we all have to deal with what has been Canada's 150 years of mistreatment, violence, and genocide against First Nations. And the sooner that we can get onto that, sooner the Liberals can get onto that, sooner that any Canadian government can get onto that, and really catch up to speed that the status quo is not good enough. Change has to happen now. The better off the entire country will be.
Well, Dr. Sinclair, I want to thank you for your insights on these matters. Thank you.
Yeah. Miigwech and Gigawamin Minowa.
After the break, NDP MP Leah Gazan will be here to talk about her private member's bill. It wants a climate emergency declared. Welcome back. Leah Gazan is the NDP Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre. Back last February, just before COVID shut down Parliament, she introduced a private member's bill, C-232, a Climate Emergency Action Act. About a month ago, it came up for second reading in Parliament, when Gazan accused Canada of not meeting a single climate target in her speech to the House.
The impacts of the climate crisis are already being felt in Canada, particularly in the Arctic and along the coast, disproportionately impacting Indigenous nations, rural communities, and communities composed of members from marginalized and racialized groups.
Joining me now is NDP MP Leah Gazan. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Nice to see you again, Todd.
In that clip, you said the climate crisis is already being felt in Canada, especially Indigenous communities. How so, specifically?
Well, and it's not just me. I mean, in fact, the current UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment released a report that outlined how the lack of a legal right to a healthy environment has a direct impact on Indigenous and racialized communities in Canada. We know many remote communities, particularly northern communities, have felt the impacts of climate change for a long time. This includes things like, communities that rely on winter roads, for example, to get supplies up, are now seeing a shortened winter season, making more difficult. There's communities that are actually under threat as a result of rising waters, as a result of the climate crisis, under threat of going underwater right now. We either act now, or we're going to further exacerbate this crisis we're in.
When you say act now, what do you expect C-232 to do to address the crisis right now if it passes?
Well, as I indicated, Canada has not met one single climate target, and their current plan under Bill C-12 will not allow us to meet climate targets. It also doesn't respect agreements we made with other nation states in Paris to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce and keep a climate measure of no more than 1.5 degrees. You don't mitigate the climate crisis by building pipelines. We know this. This current government has spent $18 billion on TMX pipeline that the PBO just indicated the net profit will be zero when you deduct what needs to happen to mitigate the impact on the environment and climate. They need to reinvest those dollars into a green economy that brings workers along that respects the fundamental rights of Indigenous peoples as affirmed through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other agreements that we agreed to as far way back as 1972 in Stockholm. It's time that Canada joined the 154 member states and confirm in legislation a clean, health, and safe environment as a human right.
At the beginning of your answer, you mentioned Bill C-12, and during your speech and the debate that followed your speech in the House last month, Conservatives criticized your bill by saying it's too similar to that government bill C-12 and another Bloc Québécois bill. So why should Parliament pass yours as well?
Well, it's actually not similar because I'm calling for 2030. The Liberals' bill is calling for 2050. That's 20 years after what they agreed to in terms of meeting climate targets in Paris. That's very different. My bill also, as a framework, a consultation framework, requires the government to develop a climate action framework in consultation with civil society and Indigenous peoples. There is no mention in Bill C-12 about any sort of consultation with Indigenous peoples, even though we know that Indigenous peoples and peoples from racialized communities are on the front line of this crisis. And let's not forget, when we're talking about consultation, the impacts we know through the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in terms of increased rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls around resource extraction that occurs. And we know that Indigenous women experience the most direct impacts of the climate emergency. And these impacts, and specifically impacts of the climate emergency, the impacts that the climate emergency has on Indigenous women need to be considered and respected, including Article 22 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Well, you mentioned United Nations rights on Indigenous peoples during your speech back then. It was around the same time that Bill C-15 was tabled. And you, in your speech, of course, linked your bill to that quite a bit. Why was that?
Well, basically, I said, this is the first bill that's being put forward in the House of Commons that calls on the federal government to stay true to their promises, to respect the human rights articulated in the Articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as this bill actually requires the government to test all legislation to ensure it's compatible with the minimum human rights that are outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My bill does exactly that. And my bill is the first bill, I'm very excited to say, that actually meets that requirement of this potential legislation that could pass through the House of Commons.
And very quickly, I'm assuming the bill won't go to the committee until we come back from the break at the end of this month.
Yes, that's probably going to happen. We're looking at having third reading, should be at some time at the beginning of March, at which time it'll be voted on.
Okay, I want to turn to the COVID crisis in Manitoba, which of course is still raging. How would you rate the efforts of Indigenous services to deal with outbreaks there?
Well, I think it's important to note that, Indigenous peoples comprise 5% of the Canadian population, yet we've received less than 1% of the funding. We know Indigenous peoples were behind prior to COVID-19 in terms of serious human rights matters, whether it be access to clean drinking water, whether it be the housing crisis in many of our communities, will be left further behind after COVID-19. We have examples during the pandemic that include places like Shamattawa, where, as a result of a housing crisis, had a very serious outbreak of COVID-19. So how do I think they've dealt with it? I think the fact that communities are dealing with outbreaks and the fact that we kept them so low because many of our leaders and community members have taken matters into their own hands to keep things safe. I would argue that this government has failed once again Indigenous peoples throughout this country.
Having said that, we're on the brink of having a vaccine distributed across the country. Will Indigenous people, you think, still get it in a timely fashion, or will there be obstructions? Like last month, the Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister said that First Nations might be skipping to the head of the line.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any room for racism when we're talking about distributing a vaccine. I think those comments, there's no place for people in power to have that kind of divisive rhetoric, particularly insinuating that there's Manitobans and then First Nations, like we're not part of the province. I found that abhorrent. Certainly we know places that require or in most need of a vaccine quickly, and that includes places where there's overcrowding. I think as a result of Canada's ongoing failure to honor the basic human right to housing in Indigenous communities, it makes sense only for me and many other people that it is critical and a life and death matter to ensure that communities, particularly communities experiencing overcrowding, communities where the government has failed to provide the minimum human right of having access to clean drinking water, should be first, and one of the first in line.
Hey, Ms. Gazan, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Good to see you again, Todd.
We'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. As we kick 2020 to the curb, it would normally be a time to look back at its highlights. But I'm like a lot of you and kind of want to forget the whole damn year, especially having to watch and report on dozens and dozens of press conferences by the Prime Minister. After a while, they all seem to blend together. I remember it all like it was yesterday.
All Canadians need to do their part. So keep practicing physical distancing. If you stay home, you should be washing your hands regularly to keep each other safe. Together, we can do this. By getting through this, we will weather this storm together. I know we're going to get through this together.
On a more serious note, NDP MP Mumilok Kakak, who represents Nunavut, last October announced a leave of absence from Parliament. At the time, no reason was given, but in a video posted earlier this week on her Facebook page, Kakak said it was due to, quote, extreme burnout, depression, and anxiety. But in that video, she also says she's ready to come back. Here's part of her 4-minute message.
I thank everyone so much for their patience and their kindness and their love and support. I'm in this for you. I always will be. Inuit and Nunavummiut deserve a life full of dignity and respect. Inuit deserve to have the right to determine themselves what they do with their future and deserve to be proud in who they are. I will always fight for you.
Now I know 2021 has to be better. I'm Todd Lamourant. Until next week, please keep safe and healthy, and thanks for watching.